Okay, in this video, we will be talking about the motivation for sex, and also we will be talking about emotions. Chapter 10 is about both motivation and emotion. So in starting to talk about issues related to sexuality, there are some terms that I think are useful to be familiar with. First is gender identity. That is the sense of who one is in terms of their sex. Do they feel like I am a man on the inside and outside, or I'm a woman on the outside and the outside and the inside, or am I somewhere in the middle? Am I gender fluid or gender queer? So that's gender identity, a sense of who one is in terms of their sex. Also, there's expression, which is different from identity. So I could identify gender identity as male, but wear all sorts of more femininely identified clothing. So how one expresses themselves is it may not even line up entirely with their identity. Some people dress more androgynously, which I mean, it's just clothes that both are most masculine and feminine. And so there's expression in terms of how one does their hair, it just kind of presents themselves to the public. There's biological sex, also oftentimes identified with what they call sex assigned at birth. And so a lot of times people want to go straight to the genes that a person has, whether it's XX or XY. But at the same time, there are some infants that are born with ambiguous genitalia. That could be an enlarged clitoris. There's all sorts of intersex conditions. In that situation, actually, I used to show a video in this class about adults who had grown up, and then when they were born, they had been identified as intersexed. And typically, parents are very uncomfortable with that because they want their child to be identified as a boy or a girl. And so it's really stressful for parents. But unfortunately, the option that a lot of parents choose is to do some sort of surgery on the sex organs of the child, of the toddler, the infant. And that can ruin one's sexual response cycle as an adult. And all these interviews I used to show were adults who'd been operated on as babies and said, that ruined my sex life for my life. And so, I'm sorry, the last category I want to talk about is sexual orientation, and that's who one is attracted to. Same sex, or they could be homosexual, opposite sex, opposite heterosexual, or being attracted to both. There's also like pansexuality, being attracted to everything, everybody. And so those are some of the basic terms as we go through the next few slides I'd like you to be familiar with. Let's see. So when you look at the research on sexual orientation, there are a lot of myths out there about what influences sexual orientation, about who one is attracted to. Typically, if you look at the overall set of research, it points to biological factors having a big influence on who one is attracted to. So it's not that someone had a bad family life or anything like that if they're gay. It's just these are biological factors. Genes account for approximately 8% to a quarter of sexual orientation. But also there are hormones that are released in the uterine environment that can influence sexual orientation. Some researchers have focused on brain structures that gay men and women have in common in terms of their size that look likely to influence who a person's attracted to. Also, I like this last line I have here: sexual orientation is discovered, not chosen. That's the biggest myth, is that somebody just randomly chooses who they're attracted to. That's it's not typically the way the research is supporting. If you look at sexual behavior and importance of brain areas, obviously we've talked a lot in this whole class about the importance of dopamine as a pleasure hormone, and there's a whole pathway in the brain that involves that, including the nucleus accumbens and the hypothalamus. These are areas that are really significant in sexual motivation. Also, both men and women have testosterone, and that is the biggest influencer of sex drive in both men and women. This is an area of research looking at sexual motivation in humans. There were two psychiatrists in the 1960s, and they did some cutting-edge research that had never been done before. They took over 690 men and women, and they said, okay, we're going to hook you up to monitors. Look, okay, your blood flow, your heart rate, your respiration, your sweating. and we want you to either masturbate or have sex. And they filmed these, watched over 10,000 sex acts, and were able to come up with basically a set of stages in terms of the human sexual response cycle. First level is excitement, which I have here with obviously the genitals becoming engorged with blood. There's a plateau phase where it's kind of excitement peaks with breathing and pulse and with blood pressure. And there's the orgasm phase, contractions all over the body. After that, there's a resolution phase. And men go through a refractory period typically where they can't have another orgasm right away. Some women can be multiply orgasmic quite rapidly. Younger men have a shorter refractory period than older men do. But if you look at what they found in the research, these are the main stages of the sexual response cycle. Some research actually was conducted recently, even at the University of Missouri, and asking people why do you have sex? And they left it open. And they gathered thousands of responses. And the number one response was, it feels good, both physically and emotionally. Also, just feeling close to someone and intimate. Feeling like that you are valued and a sense of self-worth was the number 3 whole category of responses. Sometimes it's just a way to get away from negative feelings. Instead of playing video games or eating, someone says, oh, just have sex instead. Also wanting just approval from others. That one seems a little more like that could be a potential lead to problems, but that's what was reported. There are obvious generational differences in sex. 70 years ago, most people disapproved of premarital sex. Now, less than a third thinks that's wrong at all. Most people start having sex around age 17. Oftentimes, the first sexual encounter it's usually reported as being more favorable and better if it's in the context of a close relationship and there's communication. Typically, when you hear people saying they were not happy with their first sexual encounter, often involved alcohol and someone they did not know very well. And so there's kind of a stumbling around and just unsureness about it all. If you look at the chemicals involved in sex, obviously dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter, is huge, serotonin. But one thing that happens during orgasm is a hormone called oxytocin is released. And that is the hormone of bonding. Not only is that released during orgasm, but when women are breastfeeding their babies, they also release oxytocin, and it creates a bonded sensation. So this is an important biological hormone for human beings. You've probably heard of pheromones before, basic chemicals given off by the body that to attract other people. And I mean, we know that lower animals definitely do, but we've been able to identify some in humans. It's weird that typically the pheromones that men give off in straight couples, women are usually primarily attracted to that scent when they're ovulating. And so that is the time when they're like really drawn to the pheromones of men. One weird study that was done, I know I'm taking some time here, was they had men run on a treadmill and got their t-shirts all sweaty. And they put those t-shirts in jars. Then they had women come and like smell the t-shirts and rate how attractive they were based on those pheromones. What they didn't tell them was that they put in one of those jars, the sweaty t-shirt of a family member, which kind of gross. But it was weird. That pheromone, when they smelled that of the family member, they said, that's disgusting. And it's interesting that human pheromones might be a way of communicating before, like back when human beings used to live in tribes and groups to prevent incest. Because if two closely related people have sex, if they have a child, they're both going to contribute the same vulnerabilities to that child, and that child probably will not live. So it's related probably to these pheromones that are communicated. Also, one other thing about orgasm is that if you have men and women write about the experience of an orgasm, and you don't attach to who wrote it, but you ask people who wrote this, a male or female, who wrote this, people can't tell who wrote it. So the experience of orgasm is the same. Communication about sex. There are a lot of barriers to it. A lot of times people just don't know. Actually, if you look at one research study, over half of adults missed half of the items on a basic 18-item sex test. You know, and one of the things is that I have a friend who teaches human sexuality here at Lincoln. Basically, she was telling me that a lot of her female students weren't even aware that they had 3 openings. So, I mean, that was really kind of surprising: vaginal opening, the urethra, and the anal opening. So it's like, knowing some basics. Also, in terms of not knowing where the clitoris is a huge factor in terms of the female response cycle, obviously, and how to stimulate that, which is related to the second point on this slide, is that there's so often not very good communication about sex. The couples that stay together the longest and report being happier talk more openly about sex and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. So I know people get real shy about this and they don't want to talk about it. They feel uncomfortable. But if you're not talking about it, the odds are somebody's not going to be totally happy, and it's going to likely lead to less satisfaction with the relationship. Also, a person's history, their attitudes about sex may come from being shameful or bad. That can interfere with sex. Communication is definitely the key. All right, in the time we have remaining, I'm going to switch gears and talk about some of the material on emotion that's identified in your chapter, and I will just speak briefly about some of these things. Emotions are basically a conscious response to something, but mood is just more a feeling state that's not tied to an event. Emotions are these: happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger, and you see these across the globe. No matter what culture, these are the basic emotions you see everywhere. Some research on this. Actually, when they went to, some researchers went to some very isolated cultures and basically asked them questions through translators. What would be the facial expression if you found out that your child has died? You see the same facial expressions across the globe. Another weird thing is you look at infants that were born blind, they develop the same facial expressions and responses as a child who was born fully sighted. So they learn to smile at 4 to 6 weeks and anger at 3 to 4 months. So it's interesting that, I mean, it's not just learning visually through watching a parent, but it's like these are inborn things in us. Also, there's functionality in our emotional expressions. I mean, when you're surprised, you widen your eyes, that's going to let you take in more information. If you you're disgusted by something, it's like it kind of ejects it from your whole sense, so your whole body. So that works. And smiles, when they're sincere, really disarm others and allow people to draw closer. 3 major components of an emotion. You have the bodily arousal, you have your interpretation, your cognitive appraisal of it, and then basically the response, how do you feel, are the 3 basics of emotions. This outlines 4 different theories of emotions, and each one could take probably about 5 minutes to describe. I'm not going to do that, but I am drawing your attention to these. They are in your book, and they're each described in fair detail. And some of them, the early ones, like the James Lang theory, is more historic than one that we do currently. The more current ones really involve the interpretation piece that leads to why do we have the emotional responses that we do. That's it for this section of the chapter. I hope you learned something.